We're back for another Gab with Abigail. If you're back and this is your first time on my channel, hi, welcome to Gabs with Abigail, where we talk about the Bates and Duggars and other D-list fundies. For today's video, long overdue, but we are talking about our girl Jill's book. Super excited. This is just going to be some general things that I guess caught my attention or I thought was really interesting, or that I learned for the first time reading the book. So just like a really casual kind of chat about it in general. And I will bring up Ginger's book because I have to. So let's get into it. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about Jill's book versus Ginger's book, and then I'm going to talk about some of the interesting ways that this book is a tell-all. Jill's book, that is. So one of my favorite subs, hey Linda girl, sent me like a DM saying that she thinks that my criticism of Ginger's book was too harsh. And then the other day I was listening to the Preacher's Boy podcast with Elizabeth. I'm sure if you're into IBLP stuff, you've heard her story. She was one of the Gothard's girls. That she also feels like that people were too harsh to Ginger about her book. And I felt convicted by those two things because I think I accept that criticism about how harsh I was in terms of like, I filmed this video so long ago, I can't remember if I did talk about and like applaud Ginger for how brave she was for her book. That what both Jill and Ginger do is incredibly, incredibly brave because they're talking out against the system that raised them, the system that gave them all of their childhood friends and that gave them community basically, and how difficult that is. And not only that, they did this both that they esteemed these things on a very public stage and to then rebuke those same things on a very public stage, and especially in the kind of community that prioritizes this idea as the family as the center of everything that you owe the most loyalty to, how these type of declarations from them is basically saying something negatively about their family and about their parents in particular, who, according to this umbrella of authority, of protection, just all of the things that fundamentalism teaches, is the ultimate like respect and revering and honoring that you can do on this earth, like in an earthly person. So yes, I want to give them, I want to give Ginger, I say specifically because clearly I'm giving Jill hers, Ginger her kudos for being really brave to talk about this. But I don't feel like it changes my opinion that I disliked Ginger's book. And the reason why is because I think it's fine that it wasn't a tell-all. It's just the fact that Ginger's book still evangelizes to people. And I don't think that it's appropriate to do that. Jill, just like Ginger, dedicates her book to all of the people that this lifestyle has hurt. But the thing that Jill does that Ginger doesn't is that Jill then stands in solidarity with the fact that it's really difficult to navigate the journey and the mental health aspect of this thing. And I'm with you if you are still going through the hard time and difficulty of doing that and seeing what that looks like on the other side. Because it feels like Jill, in many ways in this book, is honest and transparent about the fact that she's still doing the work herself. And that's a part of the reason why ultimately at the end of the day with this book, she has not completely reconciled with her parents, is because they're not necessarily doing the work and they don't have necessarily the intention to, which kind of feels like old people stuff, And I think to me, that's the difference. And that's also the difference in terms of like how Ginger's and Jill's books read. Jill's book reads as though she's done the work and that she's still doing the work, and that she acknowledges that is something that you put a lot of time to. Ginger's book feels more like I'm done, like I've done what I needed to, because Ginger's book just kind of feels like something that she should have waited more time to put out, and Jill's doesn't. And I think the reason for that is because, again, of how Ginger's book just doesn't have this self-awareness that this isn't the time and the space to talk to people about the fact that they should go back to Jesus. The way that Jill weaves religion as a constant through in her book is great. Is I feel like is exactly how it's done, which is I'm not telling you what you should do, but I'm telling you what I've done, how I've maintained my faith, how I've been able to remain faithful, and how even like the changes that I've made myself, for myself as a Christian, put me into this contention and this beef basically with my parents, but I don't care because I still get to feel close to God without that fear aspect that my parents gave me. And I'm moving into a happier, healthier space. And that's the prioritization in how Jill tells her story. And Ginger's book just kind of comes off just a little bit holier than thou. That's what made Jill's book so good. It just feels honest and genuine and human being. No disrespect to Ginger, because she said that her book wasn't a tell-all. She just said that it was her story. While it was her story, not entirely, because then we had to also get, here's what you should be doing. Here's how you should handle this trauma. I think in a way that's probably different from Jill, right? That Ginger is married to somebody who is a pastor, spent a lot of the community that she's built outside of her family has been within Christian ministry still. So because that is such like obviously church is a really big part of Jill's life as well, but because it's really like Ginger is very steeped in it, I think that's why we get that difference between their books and the messages that they give. And I guess this is probably why Ginger had to do this, because what else would there have been in her book? Because from Jill's book, we get that, yes, Ginger went through some contention with her parents about the pants thing. From other little comments that Jill and Derek have shared from interviews, that yes, Jeremy and Ginger have gone through some back and forth exchanges clearly with Jim, Bob, and Michelle. Why they have been able to navigate that better than Jill, I mean, we don't know, and I guess we never will know. That they felt that Ginger was just more respectful about it. Because, right, the whole big thing about Jill in the book wearing pants for the first time is that she didn't talk to her parents first. They're like, well, at least Ginger came to us. And then Ginger just kind of reassures her. They're like, yeah, I mean, they gave me a hard time, but, they'll get over it, basically. They got over it. And why was the beef with Jill like that then, And I think part of it probably is because Jill, unlike Ginger, right, was probably asking for the money first. Like, I think as soon as that got into the play, that's why it became a thing. The last thing that I want to say about, like, in a comparison of their two books, and again, part of being brave to write this is because both of them had the goal of undoing a lot of the teachings that they promoted for a really long time. And I think the self-reflection and the self-awareness of like, oh, we kind of effed up, because at the time that they were in it, obviously, could they have known? No. But I think that says a lot that they wanted to try and undo it. To say, I'm sorry that I put this out there, because it was in many ways for like my mental health, for my livelihood, it was a little bit toxic, and that it was important to put that out there. And that mattered. I think it's really, really interesting that the Duggar girls, and also to some extent the Bates, don't participate in this whole Tradwives, complementarianism, submissiveness content on Instagram. That's not what their pages are about. In many ways, their pages are meant to be like influencer-y, like that's how they make money. They've used it to be a business, basically. But I think that even if everybody has like their own secret pages where they follow who they really want to follow. I'm going to talk about John Webster someday. Like, I just think it's interesting that they are not a part of this new wave of traditional biblical womanhood that we see going on, even though they grew up so immersed in it. And the fact that we have two of the daughters going out of their way to say, oh, actually, I think we might have got it a little bit wrong. Like, I think that wasn't the best idea, because they've already walked through it. They've already seen how it's lived, like, and played out. And now part of that could also be that because they didn't marry, so far, like, almost none of them have married men who were also raised the IBLP way. I think the only one right now, looking at the daughters, is Joy. And I would still say that Joy does not fall into the category of giving us femininity, submissive wife content. Part of that being that Joy has always been a tomboy, so it makes sense that wouldn't be her moxie. Do I think that all of these women participate in some level of complementarianism and that they believe that as a part of their religion? I think yes, that's definitely, it has been hammered home, and the same goes for the Bates women. I look at someone like Soli, who, like, is really, really, really immersed in that stuff, right? The whole stay-at-home wife, you should be submissive to your husband. I don't want to vote. My husband is the head of the household. I'm feminine, not a feminist. For Soli right now, she is doing the whole, I'm going to have as many kids as God gives me. And that she has said out of her mouth that when she was younger, having read growing up Duggar, that has influenced some of her thoughts now. And I think that her as an example and having said that is so powerful. Like, the fact that the person who influenced you to live this way does not live that way anymore means something. And I also understand, obviously, that wasn't her only influence in making the decision for her life. But it just, to me, it's like, if she does ever have daughters, it's a good chance that they don't repeat. I wouldn't be surprised if they don't repeat the cycle exactly as she did. Because growing up in it, I just feel like there's too many women who we've watched who have grown up this way who have left it. And that means something. And the idea that this new generation isn't taking anything away from that is so funny. And it's just one of those things where, like, with the whole Tradwife femininity, I hate feminism movement, is I think that those women need something to rally around. They need a reason for this. Like, right, you need to have an enemy to be fighting against in order to validate what it is that you're doing. That's natural, right? It's a part of the human experience. It's just really interesting to watch, because there just has to be within Christianity this level of victimization. So big ups, big kudos to them for what they're trying to do to undo their past. I also like that Jill also talked about the difficulty of making friends and trusting them when there's been so much, like, fear and mistrust and secrecy that her family, when I say her family, I mean her parents, kind of have instilled in her. And that's something that Jinger also shared, and that just so sad. And again, also this idea of, like, why IBLP is culty, because controlling who you know and who you talk to and the level of deep conversations, the whole book is, again, this running theme of, like, counting the cost of what all of this did to her in her life. That, like, not being able to make deep friendships, not only because of how IBLP conditions you to kind of be phony, to be a little bit superficial, but that the television show meant that she was keeping secrets at any given time as well. So I think that that's, this pattern of familiarity in terms of how difficult it is to navigate the world after, how dangerous it is to not have friends. I think it is true that your husband should be your best friend. Like, that, I remember I saw somewhere that was like, oh, I think it's so weird for people to say that their husband's their best friend. Like, that should be one of your closest friends, but that you absolutely should have other friends who you can talk to and share deep things with. And it's scary not to have that, and to be growing up in a culture that doesn't encourage you to have that. Is having your best friend be your sister great? Of course, that's perfectly fine, perfectly normal. But should you have friends outside of your family? Yes, that's healthy. The fact that, like, this lifestyle doesn't really set you up for how you make those deep friendships is so interesting. Okay, so another thing that I really did not know until I read the book was just how traumatic Sam's birth was. I didn't know that she had ruptured her uterus or something like that. I was like, what? And the amount of pain that she described, I can only imagine. Like, it sounded so scary, so horrific, like insane. And the fact that Chad, oh my goodness, he has really like just the worst. Like, he has a name that sounds exactly like somebody who is a bad person working for Jim Bob. Chad, like, doesn't it like? And I wouldn't say that. You know, I love Chad, Aaron's husband. That's my guy. Like, just the Chad that works for Jim Bob, like, you sound like a terrible villainous Chad. Yeah, I did not know that. Like, horrific. And that the fact that that meant that she might not be able to have more children in the future. Like, I just kind of thought her and Derek were, you know, like, whoa, let's calm down. This was a bit much for us. And then we have a lot going on with the whole law school thing. That's why they hadn't had more, it had so much time had passed since they had Sam. I didn't realize, like, in terms of it being, I knew it was a traumatic birth. I didn't know it was that traumatic. Like, that's so scary. Like, it's so scary that happened. Like, for her to describe it like being, that she screamed bloody murder, like, is so terrifying. Which, again, giving birth, having children is really so dangerous. Whenever I hear these kinds of stories now, it's just like, yeah, this is why back in the day, having kids was so dangerous. Like, it's still dangerous now. Like, it's the maternal mortality rate, especially like for Black women, is like not good for it being 2023. But imagine it's like 1775 and your uterus, you have a uterine rupture. What are you gonna do except die? That's nuts. Like, that's nuts. Or like when people will give birth and like it's 2023 and they'll like develop like sepsis or something like that. Imagine it's 1801. What are you going to do except die? Like, that's so scary. You know, like, it's such a dangerous thing that people like underestimate. Like and the fact that that's changed Jill's body forever now. You know what I mean? It's insane. Like, and then the fact that they were so evil about paying for it. I'm still trying to get a picture for People magazine. Jim Bob Schreut. Okay, now let's talk about all the ways that this book is a tell-all. So, like, all the little juicy tidbits, I feel like that, like, we're like, oh yes, girl, this is kind of tea, you know? But that ways that were like really like intimate details in the book. Okay, so the story basically of how they went to home church, like what started it. I just thought the story was like, I don't want to say funny, but just like a bit extreme. Okay. So Jill explains the story before this of like how Nike developed so that like if there was something that they shouldn't see, they would say Nike and put their heads down. And Michelle like slut shames herself. Because like the backstory is that like one of the little kids was like, oh my God, don't look, that girl has bad clothes on. And it was like loud enough, I guess, for the person to hear. And Michelle was like, oh my God, you can't say that. That's rude. Even though she might be dressed terrible. Like, I used to once dress like a slut too. And I just didn't know any better. So that girl probably doesn't know any better. So let's be nice about that kind of thing. And Nike was born. But Nike wasn't enough. The dangers were not just out there on the street or in the mall, and they weren't just limited to the summer. They were closer to home, as I soon discovered. I didn't know at the time, but one problem was church. For as long as I could remember, we had attended Temple Baptist Church. The teaching wasn't quite the same as Mr. Gothard's, and I don't think there were any other IBLP families there, but it took a conservative line on most things, and people were kind to us even though we didn't share the same beliefs. My parents had always seemed happy enough with us going there, even if some of the other non-IBLP families had standards that were lower than ours, sending their kids to public or Christian school and allowing them to hang out with the youth group and goof off when the service was over. But it was at the end of the year when things went wrong. We attended a Christian program at a different church and sat in silent horror as female members of the youth group, which no Duggar kid had ever been allowed to attend, performed a dance. Later that night, Pops was somber as we settled down in our beds for Bible time. I am so sorry, he began, addressing us all, but looking particularly at the boys. You should not have had to seen that. I was wrong to take us there tonight. We won't be going back to that church event again. For a while, Bible time revolved around the theme of how hard it can be to do right, even in Christian circles. Not every Christian held themselves to the same standards. Sometimes, Pop said, you have to be bold and learn to stand alone. And like over some dancing, I know it was a thing that dancing is bad because it can put sexual thoughts in your mind. But again, why I said that they were in fact a part of the problem with Josh, because I'm sure these kids were not thinking about that kind of thing being sexual until you told them about it. Like, it's weird. I'm sorry. Like, it's so weird. Like, it's so weird. I'm sure this youth group, they probably weren't even that old. I want to know what kind of dance that it was that everybody was shocked. Like, I want to know it. I want to know it that everybody was shocked, because I think about, like, in like a black church where you might have, you know, like when people do like those like interpretive type dances. I'll put a clip. Right, clearly I wasn't on the dance team or whatever. But so I'm like, if it's that, like, is that sensual and like sex? Like, this is, I'm like, I feel uncomfortable even saying that about people dancing in church. Like, I like, was it like it's Ryan Reynolds on the stage with all those girls? Like, I like a bit dramatic, and I just feel like this feels very tell-all-y, because like that's why you guys left that church. Okay, and so Jill talks about how they lost the election, that they were asked by Parents Magazine to do an article. And until Shiny Happy People, I didn't realize that, because I made a video going through the article and talking about it. I told you, to this day I'm kicking myself that I didn't just save down, like copy that article to somewhere and save it, because it's scrubbed from the freaking internet. But like, I made a video commenting about how like actually you had all of this stuff going on with Josh when this happened, and I didn't realize that in the original publication, like in the print magazine, obviously, because this is pre like mass internet printing or whatever, that they did a photo shoot for the magazine, and that in that photo in Shiny Happy People, you can see that Josh isn't in it. And Jill says as much as well. I just feel like, you know, like, again, very tell-all-y. And then what Jill says about the phrase "a window of opportunity," because that's exactly what how she describes it is exactly how it feels like hearing it from Jim Bob's mouth, which this chapter is titled "A Window of Opportunity and Other Half-Truths," right? Because technically that Parents Magazine was a half-truth in many senses. Like, you had all of this going on in your family, even if the kids weren't talking about it and you're trying to move on from it, right? So, which is why you do that photo without Josh, because like, what did you explain as the reason that Josh was away? You didn't. So it was a half truth that, oh, he's away doing X, Y, and Z. You know, said Pops to all of us later at Bible Times, when I ran for Senate, I didn't see God's ultimate purpose in it. But with the article and now this TV documentary, I'm beginning to see that God has had something bigger and better in store for us. This is a window of opportunity that God has given us to show people what a Christian family can look like. This is our chance to share with the world that children really are a blessing from the Lord. I didn't know at the time, none of us did, but that phrase, a window of opportunity, would become as familiar in the Duggar house as the cries of a newborn baby, or the call of a director for there to be quiet on set. Mom and Pops would repeat those 5 words often, and just like the call of Nike, a window of opportunity would become a part of our family shorthand. It was an instant explanation of the reasons why certain choices were made, a reminder of the blessings received and the sacrifices that all of us must make in return. But with every passing season and every change that would follow, the meaning of those 5 words would alter. In time, whenever I would hear anyone talk about how that first decision to bring the TV cameras into our home was a window of opportunity, all I could think about was secrets and lies. Tea. So a little bit, another tidbit that I thought was just interesting is when Jill says that, like, when they started filming the show, they, you know, were getting more of those same benefits that they had from when they originally did that first program. And one of them being that they were given a debit card that they could use. On days that the crew was with us, they would order in food from wherever we wanted. Pops even gave us older girls a debit card so that if we were out running errands or hauling the younger ones to a music lesson or dental appointment and it was getting late in the day, we could grab food out on the way home and give him the receipts. It was a whole lot better than how it used to be, with us driving around with a crock pot of chili feeding the little ones on the run, which I just, again, think is so interesting that they would do that. And, you know, just showing like that kind of big family, don't have a lot of money struggle, that would be so much cheaper than paying for everybody to eat out during all those times, because you're going to have a lot of these times. And just, I think that's just an interesting, you know, tell-all-y little tidbit. You know, tell-all pieces don't have to be juicy. They can just be like interesting little glimpses into the life that they lived, that this isn't a part of their lives that we saw on reality television, right? Because that's what reality television money does. It puts a little bit of a shiny, glossier veneer on the life that you're living. Another part that's interesting is we finally get kind of a confirmation that Jana was, in fact, one of Gothard's girls. And let's read that. Along with some of my sisters, I was invited to attend one of their camps, IBLP, called Journey to the Heart up in Michigan. We were invited to serve as leaders, which was a great honor that I hadn't expected at all. Even more surprising, though, was the fact that after the camp, my elder sister Jana was personally invited by Mr. Gothard to visit IBLP headquarters in Chicago and work there for a while. We were new to the inner workings of IBLP, but we knew enough already to understand why it was only Jana who was invited. She was the only elder Duggar girl who was blonde, and everyone knew that Mr. Gothard liked blonde girls. We joke about it, calling Jana one of quote-unquote Gothard's girls. It didn't occur to me at all how strange, unsafe, and unwise it was. And if I had, I doubt I would have been able to speak out against it. Sweet Jilly Muffin had grown up, but I was still terrified of conflict and would do anything to avoid it. So I think that that's really bold and brave of her, again, tell Ollie, for her to say that Jana was Gothard's girls. That has been the kind of rumor on the internet. And now, while she expressly saying that Jana was like one of his victims necessarily? No. But again, this idea that it was unwise and unsafe because those girls get up there and he basically treats them like his favorite or his pet. And I'm sure Jana came home with stories about all the things that she did with Mr. Gothard or for him. Like, it's kind of like idea of Jana being one of Gothard's girls has been a lot of part of also the like why Jana has never gotten married rumors online, that kind of like experience has contributed to that. It's interesting that Jana escaped, to our knowledge, like Josh's abuse, but then to go up and be one of Gothard's like girls. And again, so that this idea of like why I still feel angry at Jim Bob and Michelle, because while did they know? No. You know, that's honest and genuine that they didn't know, right? They didn't know. And if had they known, had they known and believed it, because that's the other aspect. And I'm sure if this had all come out, then they wouldn't have believed it. Goodness. And still would have sent her. But I think, you know, that's one of those areas where we can be like, okay, like they didn't know. But it's the fact that, you know, hindsight is 20/20 years later to still not be like, but there's never really any admission of wrongdoing. And Jinger mentions this in her book too, the idea of Gothard having a thing for blondes, which also kind of, I feel like, I don't want to say brings it closer to home, that probably was, I don't know, I just kind of feel like probably it did happen. I wanted to say this because when Jinger talked about it, she talked about it more generally, that like they were at the store and they saw some blonde wigs and I think they either put them on their head or were like laughing and saying that like, oh, you'd be one of Gothard's girls, now you're one of Gothard's girls or something like that because they're blonde. And like how at the time they didn't realize how inappropriate it was to be saying that. And again, why it makes sense to me that with that kind of story, because I think this is years after, maybe, I don't know, with telling that kind of story, the way Jinger did makes me think that, you know, maybe that Jana didn't come home and say that this is what happened. I felt uncomfortable, blah, blah, blah. It's probably the case that once that either she didn't, if it did happen to her, that she didn't say anything or didn't realize that it was inappropriate until years later. Because like that's part of, I think, Elizabeth's story, that while she felt uncomfortable when it was all online, she was like, oh, but that happened to me too, but that's not what that was, you know? So I think that's really, okay, I'm going to end with this because I wanted to talk about it anyway. This story that Jill tells about Jim Bob, and kind of like this being the first time almost where she questions like, you know, him. And I thought this was such an interesting story because it really does say a lot about Jim Bob's character and kind of how IBLP's like cherry-picked teachings work, and sort of just the kind of arrogance that being on television making this money really produced. With every season of the show that went out on TLC and every one-off program that Pop signed us up for, I could see him grow. He had sold his old used car lot and vehicle towing service back when he had entered politics, but he had kept his car dealer's license up to date and still loved going to car auctions. He rented some land to Josh that he used as a car lot, and sometimes Pops would put some of his own vehicles out on Josh's lot to sell. As the show grew, Pops got more into buying real estate and focusing on maintaining what he had. But whenever he was talking about the show and the ministry impact he thought he was having, he really came alive. I've always had this great desire to reach people for Christ, he said one day, not long after he'd returned from a trip to New York City where he and Mom, Jessa, Ginger, and Jordan, the newborn 18th Duggar, had appeared on The View. When we were flying in over the city, I was asking myself, how could we reach this many people for the Lord? And then it occurred to me that there were so many people watching the show. We're reaching millions. I never would have dreamed that God would allow our family to have this influence over all these people. I shared his amazement that we had ended up in this position. It was wild and crazy that a family like ours from Northwest Arkansas should end up like this in just 5 years after this first documentary. And it was even more wild and crazy that we'd done nothing at all to make it happen in the first place. The only possible explanation was that God had opened the doors for us. He had made a way. This show, being a filming family, this was his calling on our lives, for now at least. The NYC story became one of Pop's favorites. I heard him tell it often, especially when it seemed like he wanted to help someone understand that we really weren't in it for the perks or the fame or anything like that, or he needed to explain that the show came to us and that we didn't go looking for it. Ever the salesman, Pops always seemed to know how to pitch it right, and his story always worked. At least it appeared to work until the one time that it didn't. I heard about it weeks later. A young man who was a family friend had apparently been talking with Pops one day at the big house. Pops had been trying to persuade the guy to agree to be in some filming, talking about the ways he believed that God was using the show to impact so many people, inferring that the numbers reached by our show on television had a greater impact than lots of other ministries. Think about how many people we are able to reach through the show, Pops had continued. Oftentimes we are reaching people who would often never step foot into a church, yet they invite us into their living rooms each week. It's such a huge opportunity God put right in our laps, and we should be good stewards of what he has given to us. That's very interesting, Mr. Duggar, the guy said, choosing his words carefully. But Jesus, he talked to people one-on-one too. I think that's still vitally important today. Apparently, Pops was frustrated by the pushback, so we tried a different angle and a new analogy. Just picture yourself in a stadium, and someone gives you a microphone. He let his words hang in the air for just a moment longer than necessary, as if the idea was so big and so magnificent that it needed extra time to compute. You can speak to everyone in the stadium and tell them about the Lord. You'd take that opportunity in a heartbeat, wouldn't you? I mean, it's a no-brainer, right? The guy shifted awkwardly, wondering whether speaking the truth to power was worth it. He chose truth. I don't know, Mr. Duggar, sir. Not if God had told me to go and talk to the person under the bleachers. If I knew that the Lord wanted me to go talk to the one instead of the thousands, then I'd have to obey. Pops froze. He looked like he had just swallowed a fishbone. He said when he recovered himself, shaking his head. No way. God would never tell you to do that. When I heard the story, I was kind of stunned. Was Pops really saying that he believed it was always God's desire for people to be involved in whichever ministry reached more people? And was he telling our friend that he knew God's will for this guy's life and that it included filming? Was he really saying that to trust God's timing, we have to be able to see the results in our lifetime? Amen, Jill. This was a good book. I'm telling you, so I said that's why I feel like this book is so much more powerful from a religious aspect than Ginger's. Stories like this. This was contrary to what Pops had always taught us kids. We'd grown up with him reminding us that little is much when God is in it, and that we don't always see how God is working. Yet Pop's words went directly against times in the Bible where Jesus broke away from large crowds to address or minister to one person. It left me feeling confused and kind of sad. And yeah, I just feel like that speaks volumes to where Jin Bob was at in life and still is, and where, Jill is kind of starting to see beyond the facade of my dad is this great guy, blah, blah, blah. I think everybody reveres their parents as special and wonderful, but the emphasis that's placed on it in IBLP is crazy. And I think everybody goes through a phase where, you kind of see the more into the reality of what your parents really are as people, which is that they're flawed human beings. But from this kind of aspect, I think of how Jill's growing up, and just kind of what Christianity is, how that must have been whoa, a shock, for him to say that. But why, her having the critical thinking still at that point to be able to see that wrong is so important, because that kind of thinking, that kind of questioning is going to be helpful, is going to allow her to question later why she can't make changes to her life, right? Why there was all this control. Why are you using this kind of scripture to justify this when this is what the whole text says, blah, blah, blah. So I guess I'll end it there with that quote. It was really, really good, Jill. It was a great book. Oh, the last closing chapter, actually, maybe that's where I'm going to close it. It was a really, really good book. It was really, I didn't even talk about how she talks about going to therapy and all of that. But she does. And it's really just a really powerful book. And it feels like she's doing the work, and I'm so happy for her. And how far she's come in her journey, and her willingness to share it, right? Again, where I said the difference between her and Ginger's book is also that Jill has kind of got married first. So she's been out of the lifestyle just a little bit longer. She's been walking through this just a little bit longer. So where, again, it feels kind of more appropriate for her to be saying that here's where I'm at, and here's how I'm growing, and I'm not done. I'm not finished, but I finally feel healed enough in this place in my life to talk about this. And I think it's important right now to talk about it. Yeah. All right. That's it for me. Those are all of my thoughts. I probably have more thoughts. I didn't do this video like super organized, just getting back into the flow of things. Can't wait to hear your thoughts, because I'm sure you've had them and have already discussed elsewhere. But I'm still curious to know what your opinions were of the book. Did you think I was too harsh with my review of Ginger's book? Yeah, so see you guys for the next one. Hopefully it's not 13 months from now.
Let's go. It's like you niggas gotta stop acting